Thank you for joining us. My name is Kevin McGarry. I'm the Associate Director for Public Engagement at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. The Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1963. Our mission is to steward the past and present of the Presidio neighborhood and inspire preservation advocacy throughout Santa Barbara County in order to create a more vibrant community. One of the ways that we do this is through free educational and public programming, like our program this evening that we're all gathered here to attend. But before we start, and before we get Kaitlin started with her presentation, I just want to help everyone out and give a few important details about the Zoom webinar experience tonight, and some details that you might find interesting. Our presentation this evening will be closed captioned with subtitles for our audience members that are hearing impaired. You can find the control to turn on or turn off the subtitles on your screen in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. It is a CC icon that you can click on and you'll get a drop-down menu with options. If you do not see the CC icon, click on the more icon. It's the little 3 dots and it should pop up and you should see the closed caption icon there. This presentation will be recorded and it will be made available at a later date. So if you have anyone, any friends or colleagues or family that aren't able to be with us tonight, they will be able to watch the recording at a later date on our the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation website or our YouTube channel. We will be answering some of your questions. Kaitlin will be answering some of your questions after tonight's presentation. We probably won't get to all the questions depending on time. But you can, during the presentation, there are 2 ways for you to ask your questions. You can use the chat box function or the Q&A function, both of which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. We won't get to the questions until after our presentation is complete, but we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Before we begin tonight's event, we want to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our region. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all indigenous people have shown worldwide. We are on the traditional territory of the Chumash peoples. Our presenter tonight is Kaitlin Brown, and very soon to be Dr. Kaitlin Brown. She's in the final weeks of her doctoral program at UC Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on indigenous experiences under successive waves of Spanish and Mexican colonialism in California, and ways that Native communities both formed and evolved over time. In 2019, she led an archaeological field school at Mission La Purísima State Historic Park, which aimed to uncover the indigenous past from the mission. Kaitlin recently joined the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation's Board of Directors, and we're really lucky to have her as a board member. We're even more lucky to have her as a presenter tonight, since tonight we are among the first to learn about Kaitlin's fascinating research and recent archaeological findings in her Ph.D. work at UCSB. So without further ado, I'd like everyone to welcome Kaitlin, and she's going to take it away. And I'll be back to help with Q&A at the end. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm seeing a lot of familiar names in the participants, and it's so great to have this support and see everybody. I'd especially like to thank the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation for inviting me to present my research with you all today. And my research was conducted at a Chumash village in the Purísima area. And my home university at UC Santa Barbara is situated in the Barbareño Chumash area. And as a result, my work has directly affected these lands and the peoples of these lands. And I want to begin by acknowledging the Chumash people, past, present, and future, especially the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians and the elders. And although I cannot speak directly for the Chumash, archaeology has made it possible to give voice to this amazing culture and heritage in this region, and to begin building better relationships with Chumash peoples today. The research that I'm going to be sharing with you really started over a decade ago when I worked at California State Parks after just receiving my bachelor's degree at UC San Diego. And the first archaeological survey I ever did as a California archaeologist was at La Purísima Mission State Historic Park. And when you arrive at the mission, you really take a step back in time. It's nestled in this rural setting, and it's one of the few examples of a nearly complete mission complex that was reconstructed in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the location of this mission is also unique in California's history because it was built relatively late in 1813 during the Mexican Revolution. And it came after the first mission, Mission La Purísima Vieja, had collapsed in an earthquake. And when you follow the visitor trail, one of the first things you see is this amazing salmon-colored bell tower. And then you're taken to the Padres quarters, where you walk down a colonnade. And in the back of the Padres quarters, there's a reconstruction of some of the everyday activities, such as this grinding stone that was used to press olives and make olive oil. And along the tour, you pass through the blacksmith shop, where when you go inside, you get a glimpse of some of the activities that are occurring at the mission, really adding to this colorful picture of daily life. And toward the end of the tour, you get to the area of where the native community lived. And a sign explains that this is the area that marks the Indian apartments for the few favored neophytes. And when you finally arrive there, the space feels isolated compared to the rest of the mission because it wasn't ever reconstructed in the 1930s like the rest of the mission was. And instead, what's there are a series of these linear stones in the ground that mark the area of where the apartment building would have been. And this is arguably one of the most important places in the mission landscape because it's the area where the main mission population lived. And we know who lived there. There were hundreds of Chumash people living at Mission La Purísima, and they came from different villages in the Purísima, Cuyama region, and on the Northern Channel Islands. And in 1813, in the mission records, there were 507 Chumash men and 497 Chumash women recorded, each representing these many different villages. And archaeology helps to really restore this community and bring out a more realistic interpretation of what's happening in the mission in the early 19th century. And the material record tells a story of how Chumash people, they ventured out to their traditional gathering locations to gather food, and they continued to practice the production of shell bead money. And it also tells a story of change as the native community became entangled with ranching and industrial practices that was tied to Spanish and Mexican colonialism. But before I talk too much about the finds from our 2019 Archaeological Field School, I first want to start by highlighting the framework of this project. Because these days, it's not enough to do archaeology just for the sake of doing research. It's really through archaeology that we can bring out subaltern narratives, and we can create teaching opportunities, and we can work with local indigenous groups. So Mission La Purísima Concepción being a state park and in close proximity to UC Santa Barbara, and also a historic Chumash village, provided a great opportunity to really work with the public and the San Ynez Band, Chumash Indians, and also students at UCSB. For California State Parks, the main goal was to mitigate a pedestrian walkway that goes right through this village space. And a part of this was assessing some of the damage that could have been done to the buildings. It also aimed at explaining some of the finds to visitors to the park. And this is one of my favorite photos showing me just talking to some of the many and the diversity of visitors that would come to visit us. And we would have upward about 20 people a day where we would explain some of the archaeological finds that were recovered over the course of that field season in 2019. And with the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, this project sought collaboration through presenting research to the Elders Council to gain feedback, reaching out to descendants whose ancestors were baptized at the mission, including youth in the archaeological excavations, having a tribal monitor on present at all times, and also collaborating on a temporary interpretive panel that was up over the course of the season. And I had an opportunity to take Dr. Nikki Sandoval and her mother, Virginia Ortega, on a tour of this residential area. And they are directly linked to an ancestor that was baptized at Mission La Purísima. And not only was I able to share a little bit about this community, but I also learned a lot about their heritage and ancestry to this mission. And finally, with UCSB, I was able to get the students involved, and this included teaching an archaeological field school, training a diverse group of students in hands-on excavation techniques, mentoring those students. I recently led a symposium for the 55th Annual Society for California Archaeology meeting, where 7 of my field school participants presented their original research in that symposium, and this has later turned into a coming publication. And here's a picture of just some of the few students that participated in that symposium and what an average day really looked like in the field. Other important parts of the project included the use of ground penetrating radar to determine subsurface features. I got Freddie Romero, who is the cultural preservation consultant with the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians, to help out with us with this ground penetrating radar one day. And what this does is it's able to detect these subsurface anomalies without doing any excavation. So with his help, we were able to detect some of the subsurface features. And this later helped with the placement of some of these historic maps that I found when I was doing research in the curation facility at the mission. And these maps were produced in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and also in the 1960s when an archaeologist named James Dietz led an excavation there, and he was able to show more clearly what these apartments looked like. And what they were a series of 2 rooms, and there were 20 rooms altogether. And there was a little zogwan right here that separated these 2 buildings. And then to the area to the south over here was the infirmary. And what I did after finding these maps is I took them and I uploaded them into GIS. And this is Geographical Information Systems, where I was able to pinpoint exactly what this would have looked like in real space and find an area to place an archaeological unit to excavate inside one of these apartment buildings, one of these rooms. And what I ended up doing was placing 3 units in the 8th room in this one building here, which is referred to as Building A because it was one of the first buildings established in this region in 1813. This one came a little later in 1822, and the infirmary was actually built in between these 2 buildings in 1815 or 16. So I placed a unit right here to get a glimpse of the everyday activities that would have been occurring by a Chumash individual in one of these rooms. And about 1 meter down, we came across a roof tile collapse. And the roof tile collapse, this shows a stratigraphic profile of what that looked like. And you could see it was patchy in areas. So when we were first coming down on it, it was a little hesitant whether this was a real event that happened where a roof had collapsed on top of a floor, or if perhaps this represented a trash pit that from an earlier excavation in the 60s. But things became more clear once we removed the roof tile. We came across an earthen floor. And right around that earthen floor was charcoal and bits of shellfish and other little pieces of roof tile. And also right on top of that floor, one of the most amazing finds of the project was this pestle and this grinding stone that were in situ together right on top of this earthen floor. And I really love this juxtaposition of the pestle and the grindstone because it really symbolizes the connection of the past and the present of the native individual who lived in this room and their traditional practices mixed with new colonial practices. The pestle is designed in this classic late period Chumash style, being large and elongated and tapered in at one end, while the grindstone is a type of sharpening wheel introduced during the colonial period. And the grindstone would have been placed in the center of a trough and spun around with a crank or with water. And this would create a surface to sharpen tools like scissors or other types of sharp objects like knives. And we also found a whole red abalone right on top of the floor, as if it had been intentionally placed there. And when I went in to excavate this red abalone on top of the floor, after I pulled it up, I handed it over to our tribal monitor, Gina, and it was really chilling in this moment in time, handing this shell over, because Gina then recited this Chumash prayer. And in this moment, it really felt like linking the past to the present within this space, all connected to this really symbolic and traditional abalone shell, which Chumash have used for thousands of years. But we didn't just focus on inside the apartment building. We also looked around the building at some refuse. And when we went through all of the archaeological materials and we took them back to the lab, we sorted through the many different types of categories that were there, such as shellfish and animal bone and ceramics. And once all these artifacts were sorted, we were able to do further analysis into using classification schemes. For the shellfish, for instance, we typed it into 24 different species to better understand what types of marine invertebrates were being regularly eaten. And when we look closely at the data, it is the Mytilus californianus, or the California mussel, that stands out compared to the other types of fish that were identified. It makes up 96% of the marine invertebrates. So mussel was clearly an important part of Chumash communities' subsistence practices. And what's really interesting is that patches of mussel are located at least 15 miles away from the mission. One of the patches with the highest density of mussel comes from a source called Lompoc Landing in the Vandenberg Air Force Base. And this was likely a traditional gathering place that was utilized in the past before mission times as well. So the study of marine invertebrates really highlights the autonomy of native groups who left the mission to make these extended forays to the coast to gather their traditional foods. And it also contributes to understanding the use of these traditional gathering locations that were likely passed down through generations. The study of terrestrial mammals, reptiles, and birds also has really interesting patterns. As you can see, there was a mix of hunting practices with both domesticated animals and the consumption of local animals. So deer, jackrabbit, bobcat, brush rabbit, gray fox, turtle, and crow represent the local and wild species that were identified. But the vast majority of animals that were identified in this refuse was domesticated cow and sheep. And this is really similar to other missions where Native communities began to shift traditional hunting practices to eating more of what the mission provided in this ranching and agricultural setting. And these domesticated animals became entangled in the daily life of Chumash residents at the mission. And one discovery during the 2019 field season was the footprint of an ungulate, likely a calf or a sheep, on a ladrillo that was recovered on the floor of the apartment unit. And it recounts a setting of the embodied sights and sounds at the mission at this specific moment in time in the early 19th century. We also found many different types of olivella shell beads and evidence for the production of these shell beads. And for thousands of years, the Chumash would use shell beads in their systems of exchange. And we know that at least for the last 2,000 years, they were used as a form of currency. And in the historic period, the beads change in form. They were more expediently manufactured, and this was partly due to the introduction of the needle drill by the Spanish that replaced the more traditional use of stone drills. We know what the beads would have looked like during this historic period because they are large, they have chipped edges on the side, and there's a very small perforation hole where only a metal needle could have been used. Overall, there were 82 olivella shell beads that were found over the course of the field season, and they were typed into 10 different categories. Most of them comprise of this H1A ground disc, which essentially means that these are those large beads with this small hole. And we know that beads that are H1A were specifically made between 1770 and 1800. And because these are earlier than Mission La Purísima, the beads likely carried over from the first Mission La Purísima Vieja to the new setting at Mission La Purísima Concepción. There were also a lot of rough disc beads, and these were produced specifically between 1816 and 1834, just during the time that Mission La Purísima Concepción was occupied. And finally, there are these chip disc beads that represent the period from after the missions were secularized, between 1834 and the 1900s. With the recovery of these H3 chip disc beads, it represents a community that lived at this mission and were making beads after 1832 and into the American period. We also found a lot of shell bead production detritus, which is left over from the olivella shell after a shell bead is made. And this is Brian Barbier, who is the associate curator at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and he's a leading bead expert. He conducted these experimental studies that show just how much detritus is made with the manufacturing of one shell bead. And when we calculated all of the detritus from the 2019 excavations, we found that there are far more shell beads being produced than the 82 that were accounted for, suggesting that these beads are being exported to other communities in the Chumash homeland, perhaps other missions, and also beyond the Chumash homeland to the Yokuts and maybe even as far north as the San Francisco Bay Area. And finally, we identified 135 different types of glass beads. And these glass beads can be typed into different categories based on their process of manufacturing. The glass beads highlighted in yellow here are wire wound beads. They were individually made by a skilled bead maker, and they took a long time to make. These beads represent drawn cane beads, and they were more easily manufactured. A special bead person, what they would do is they would take a single molten cane of glass and they would cut this glass into many different pieces. And this is why we find a large representation of these beads in the archaeological record, because they are the simplest form of bead to make. And in fact, out of the 135 shell beads, 75% represented these drawn cane beads that were made. And then finally, there are these Prosser molded beads. And these beads are technically made of ceramic, but what's most interesting about the Prosser molded beads is that they were specifically made after the 1840s. And when we find them, it represents, again, a native community that lived there post 1840. The glass beads also came in a variety of colors. They were mostly blue, white, green, and black. And this representation is typical to what is found in other missions left behind by other native communities in Southern California. So with all of these archaeological data, it really adds and contributes to this more nuanced and dynamic narrative of this community, Amuwu. We know that the Chumash peoples who lived here came together in the early 19th century, and they brought with them their traditional practices. We know that at the same time, they incorporated new ways of living into their daily routines. And the material record is able to speak to a distinguishable native identity that forms at this mission. And it really enriches our understanding of this space in the broader mission context. And what emerges is this vibrant Chumash settlement and a realistic interpretation of what this mission would have looked like. Future work now is aimed at collaborating with California State Parks and the San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians on an interpretive panel that really highlights this work and this community. And I am currently in the process of interviewing descendants who have ancestors that were directly linked to this mission in order to document their histories. So in closing, I just would love to encourage you all to visit La Purísima Mission State Historic Park and Museum. And hopefully now you can visualize a little more about its past and its important place to Chumash people and our collective California history. So thank you.
Thank you, Kaitlin, and thank you. I already have some questions coming in. So, what a great snapshot of what it sounds like an amazing field school experience, and how much you found is kind of astonishing to me. From what I know of archaeology, I'm not a trained archaeologist, but it seems like you found a lot of really interesting and important things. So I guess I'll start with the two questions that we got kind of about the finds. The first one is from John Steele, and he asked, could some of the refuse found in apartments have been deposited in the post-mission era when property was used for agricultural purposes? How did you know that the finds were from a specific period? Is maybe
That's a really good question. So I used the archaeological principle of stratigraphy. And essentially, there were a few stratigraphic levels there. There was the fill, which is under the roof tile collapse. And then there's everything that represents the roof tile collapse to the surface. So everything above the roof tile collapse would represent the post-mission period where the missions really weren't being taken care of anymore. And everything under the roof tile collapse really does represent more of a mission period assemblage and its context at a time where buildings are continuously being operated and used, and the mission is in full gear. So it's really with that stratigraphic principle of everything under the roof tile collapse that aids in understanding what was going on during that mission period.
Great.
But it's different when you actually get outside of the apartment building. And that's why we have artifacts typologies that help us distinguish when certain types of artifacts were used, like with the typology of the shell beads, showing either the early or middle or later part of the mission period, and then with the glass beads.
Great, thanks so much. I hope that answers your question, John. It sounds like they have a couple processes for that. And then Mike asked, do you believe that all of these beads, so they're shifting over to the beads that you found, do you believe that they were incorporated in beaded items, or do you think that they were scattered or stored loose, and or were they separated ahead of time, or were they a part of something put together? And how would you kind of guess about that?
That's a really great question too. I think that the beads were likely not all strung together. They represent many different types. And I believe that these beads were incorporated into the shell bead money system, and they were used for systems of exchange, and they had particular values attached to them. And some glass beads, like the wire wound beads that took longer to make versus the drawn cane beads that are more simply produced, that they had a higher value attached to them and perhaps could have been traded for something of a higher value, like a nicer basket. So I don't think that these beads are being strung and traded. I think that these are being used in the same ways as the shell money beads and being traded in that respect.
Thank you. And so we have a question that came in the chat, which I think her question is about the prayer that was spoken over the abalone shell. If you know the name of the prayer, but this is from Maria. She's also asking, did you have representatives from the San Ynez band and indigenous people there with you when you found a lot of these things? And were there other examples of prayers spoken over the items, or was there was the community able to see the items that you found as you were finding them?
As I was finding them, no, this took place over a field school I was on Saturdays, and the tribal monitor was there with us on every Saturday. And I did recently, I guess COVID recently, a few months ago, present my research to the San Ynez band and giving them the final results, where I did show them these discoveries that were found. And with the abalone shell, that was the only instance where a prayer was conducted.
Great, and I guess a bigger question that I have out of that is the process of working with the indigenous community up there, and how important it was for you during this process, before, during, and after the field school, to make them an integral part of the process, and maybe expand a little bit about your reasoning and how you went about reaching out and doing that, because I think that's such an interesting and cool part of your presentation, is that throughout all of these, this weeks-long process, you seem to have people come and join you, and also you had mentors and people there to help you interpret objects and things like that.
Yeah, well, it started just by making an appointment with the Elders Council and presenting my research before I even started. So this started in 2017. And after that, really getting my project together and finding a tribal monitor, reaching out to Dr. John Johnson at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and his help aided with identifying Chumash peoples who had been baptized at Mission La Purísima. So that's how I got in touch with Dr. Nikki Sandoval and Virginia Ortega. So it really was just a long and continuous process that has a lot more work that needs to be done. I still am in the middle of conducting these interviews, which was halted because of a newborn baby, but I'm still conducting these interviews of descendants who have an ancestor that were baptized at Mission La Purísima. And this interpretive panel is something I'm really hoping that this is going to get done soon with state parks in collaboration with the band to really highlight this space and the subaltern narrative in this space.
Okay, and maybe two final questions that I think are really forward-looking. Are you gonna? Someone's asking if you're gonna write a book about the Chumash. if you're gonna continue studying the Chumash and continue this work moving forward, is this your how you see your career moving forward in terms of the indigenous population that you're gonna be focusing on?
Yes, I do have plans for a book, and what I'm going to be doing after this, in collaboration with the Chumash, and this is still all up in the air, but what I envision is doing a through time piece of looking at Mission La Purísima Vieja before the earthquake, and then looking at the community that moved to Mission La Purísima Concepción. And then after mission secularization, looking at the many different other Chumash communities that formed after 1832, like Los Alamos and some of the communities up there. So I do want to string together a more complete picture of these Chumash communities that formed during the historic period, and also be able to link this to present day with the collaboration and help of the San Ynez Band.
Awesome. And then a final question that's kind of related to that is these objects that you found. Alan Salazar, Chumash elder who volunteers for the trust and works with us, he asked, what's the plan for the artifacts? Are they going to be curated? Do you know where they're going to end up? And how can they be viewed by the public in the future?
That's a really great question, and something I'm currently working on right now. The plan is to bring them back to Mission La Purísima. I also have an idea of making this accessible to people online. I have a lot of pictures and would like to do something like a virtual museum. So because of COVID, everybody has online access, and we could all view these amazing finds. And I know that the Chumash Museum is currently opening, and it's my goal to reach out to them and ask what they would like to do with these artifacts of theirs.
So hopefully at some point people will be able to get to see the fruits of your labor and see these things and interpret it somewhere. That's awesome. So I'm going to end it there. There's a lot of good questions coming through. Katie, I'm wondering if I can put your email in the chat, so people, if they have questions, can reach out to you, or if you have questions, I can forward them to her. Because I know that there's a lot of questions coming in. We're just running out of time. But I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. I want to thank you, Kaitlin, for your time and for showing us all the amazing work you've been doing. I think it's incredible to see that there's just so much more to discover and so much more to learn about in terms of the Chumash peoples and their communities over time. So yeah, and I hope everyone can join us for our future events. You can find our future events on our calendar, which is on our website, sbthp.org/calendar. And we'll have more, hopefully in the future, some in-person events. We were hoping to have this one in person in the theater here at the Trust, but we'll be continuing to have these virtual events and host these virtual events for all of you to participate in and enjoy. So thank you, Kaitlin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody.